Salamat, everyone. My name is Ahmed. I am Palestinian from Gaza. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I am dialing in today from, and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This land was never ceded, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm dialing in from Camaragal country. This land was the ground zero of a genocide that occurred more than 200 years ago, and its echoes still reverberate to our day. I want to welcome you today with an interview I've had with Matt Kennard. Matt Kennard is a British independent investigative journalist and author. He was formerly head of investigations at Declassified UK, and was also a fellow and then director of the Centre for Investigative Journalism in London. Matt Kennard is the author of Irregular Army and The Racket. Matt and I spoke about the current situation in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in Syria, and the prospect of another Trump administration in the White House. I hope you'll find my conversation with Matt useful and productive. All right, perfect. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Matt, for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Early in the morning now in the UK.
Yeah, it's good to be with you. No worries.
So, Matt, I mean, you've been following and reporting on the situation in Palestine and the Middle East for many years now. You wrote 2 books about your investigative journalism. I don't have to tell you that the situation in the Middle East and in Palestine is getting more and more difficult, more than ever before, really. So, the state of Israel is committing a genocide, an ongoing genocide for the past 14 months, unabating, getting worse and worse by the day, leaking into the West Bank potentially soon. So there's been many, legal proceedings made by the highest legal establishments in the world, the International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice, many reports, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and so on and so forth. So many of those legal proceedings have overtly called the international community, all governments, all countries, to actually impose sanctions on Israel and, at least to stop sending weapons. And we've seen some sort of movement around that issue, although a bit kind of shy of a movement. But I mean, in the UK, for example, in Germany, in Canada, I mean, has this been enough? And I know you've been reporting on what's happening in Cyprus and how that, airbase in Cyprus is related to what the Israeli genocide in Gaza. So could you elaborate on the significance of all these legal proceedings when it comes to, punishing Israel for their crimes against the Palestinians?
Yeah, well, first, to answer your question directly, it's definitely not enough. It's nowhere near enough because it goes on, and it goes on with complete impunity, effectively. No other country could get away with what Israel has done for the past 14 months in the world. No one. So the international legal system, the whole international system of law, I think, has failed. And Israel has stress tested all the things that we're told exist in this world, that there's mechanisms where we can stop a genocide, where we can restrain powers that commit awful crimes habitually, daily. They're killing up to 100 people a day, often, sometimes more than 100 people per day. So huge massacres just happening every day for months and months and months. So we haven't done enough because it goes on. But having said that, the ICC arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, Gallant is now no longer the defense minister, but was for most of the genocide, is a huge watershed moment for the world, I think, because the ICC has always focused on official enemies of the West and effectively was set up by that. I don't know if you saw Lindsey Graham recently, the US senator, gave a speech where he said, Oh no, the ICC shouldn't issue arrest warrants for Israeli officials because it's not for us. The ICC wasn't set up to prosecute us because we're the good guys. It's for the global South and for official enemies, which was obviously a repugnant statement, but I appreciate the honesty because we know that's the case. But he said it out in the open, and so I think that the fact that the ICC finally, it took too long, way too long, in my opinion, finally did that is huge because the psychology of the whole imperial system rests on the fact that we are good guys and we project power in a way that is concerned with human rights and freedom and democracy and all these different buzzwords. So the fact that one of our main allies, who basically couldn't operate without our support, is now headed by a wanted war criminal is huge. And I think will have a huge psychological impact over the coming generation. And it's a watershed moment for Israel as well, because they've obviously had impunity basically forever until now. I mean, the genocide is a next level crime for them, but they've been committing crimes with impunity for decades and decades, going all the way back to 1948. So this is an important change. Also, the genocide case at the World Court, which was brought by South Africa, but South Africa has now been joined by other countries like Ireland and Spain and others. We don't know what their findings will be, although I predict that if it was an independent process, they would find that genocide has been committed. But that is also a huge process, and you see how important it is because you saw the pushback from the Israelis. There's a lot of propaganda was put out when that case came because it looks so bad. So I think that there's two sides to it. We haven't done enough, and the institutions have taken too long to do anything. But we are seeing the beginnings of, I think, the end of the impunity for Israel, and that is vital because Israel is a small country. You know, it's got the same population as the city I'm in, which is London. Its GDP is smaller than Sweden. It gets the vast majority of its arms from America. It couldn't operate without the United States, but also UK and Germany for a month. So it's very, very important that as citizens in the West, we understand that Israel is a puny little country that is basically a colony of the West and couldn't operate without our support. And our focus should be on cutting the umbilical cord, which runs from London, from Berlin, from Washington to Tel Aviv. Because if we do that, Israel might have to change its behavior and actually become a normal country which abides by international law, which it's never been. So I think that process has begun in a way that maybe it never has before. So that in the midst of the horror, there is hope. My only concern is that things go back to how they were when the genocide ends, which it will eventually. There's rumors now of a ceasefire for 60 days or maybe a permanent ceasefire, but it can't go on forever. So when it stops, we need to maintain the momentum, which has been gathered through the ICC case, through the ICJ case, and through the vast amounts of activism which has happened all over the world over the last 14 months, and push on to really make sure Israel is made a pariah country. Because if you see what happened with South Africa with the end of apartheid in the 1990s, that only happened because citizens took it upon themselves to sever the link between their government and the South African apartheid regime. The apartheid regime was supported by the UK, the US, the usual suspects, but there was a huge boycott movement. There was huge activism for decades to try and stop the support that we were giving and also to bring down the apartheid regime. And it was eventually successful. We have to have that kind of imagination and believe that Israel can be stopped, but also I believe push the imagination further and think that Zionism can be dismantled, because Zionism is a supremacist colonial ideology that is predicated on the expulsion of native people and their permanent subjugation. It has no place in the 21st century. So we should aim to push our imagination further and aim to our movement, the pro-Palestine movement, to dismantle Zionism. And not be scared to say that. And I think, again, over the last 14 months, it's become much more mainstream. You can talk about Zionism in ways maybe you couldn't before. So there is a lot of hope, but we haven't done enough because it goes on. That's the bottom line. As long as this genocide is going on and it's it's even in the last few months, some of the most awful crimes have been committed in the whole 14 months. So we need to stop that now and do everything we can to do that.
Absolutely. I mean, the ICC and ICJ rulings are they provide us with weapons to actually use against all these, entities that are complicit in the genocide or in Israel. So it gives us, that disposal of or repository of kind of ammunition to use for the fight against Zionism and all that.
Yes.
I'm keen to learn a little bit more about your research that you conducted as to the relationship of the airbase in Cyprus and how it actually is helping tacitly, because not many people know about what's happening in Cyprus and its connection to the genocide. Like I mentioned, the England or the UK has suspended three weapons contract with 30, I think 30 out of what 350, which is very very small amount, but behind the scenes there's a lot happening.
Yeah. Well, just to add on to your previous question, actually, I should have said that one of the ways that the ICC has failed is that I think their investigation should start and charges should be brought against not just Israeli officials, but
Soldiers as
the
well.
UK officials and US officials who are not just complicit, they're participating through special forces, intelligence sharing, and probably elements that we're not even aware of yet. And a lot of that, as you mentioned, is being done through this base on Cyprus, which is called RAF Akrotiri, and it's sort of in southern Cyprus on the coast, and it's a base that we've had ever since Cyprus was nominally given independence in 1960. Britain retained 3% of the landmass of Cyprus, turned one area in the west called Akrotiri into a huge airbase, and in the east there's another one called Dekelia, which is a huge intelligence station, and they're both intimately involved in a genocide. And also, not just the genocide, all imperial operations and bombing operations in the Middle East have some RAF Akrotiri and Dekelia are used to some degree. So, for example, the UK was bombing Yemen yesterday, and those bombers went from Cyprus to bomb Yemen. So it's not just Gaza, but what became clear early on in the genocide was that the RAF Akrotiri, particularly, was being used by the British as a kind of international hub for the buildup of forces, spies, and weapons to get them to Israel, because it's a 40-minute flight time to Israel. I found straight away that huge military transport vehicles, they're called C-17s and A400s, so they can carry up to 150 troops, and Black Hawk helicopters and Abrams tanks. They're huge. There was one basically going every day in the aftermath of October 7th to Israel from RAF Akrotiri. And the government was saying, well, it's just, well, they gave two reasons that they were sending so many transport flights. They said, one is we're taking medical supplies, and the other was that we're transporting ministers. But it doesn't add up, because you don't need that many flights to take medical supplies, number one. And number two, and the ministers, only a few went in the whole 6 months after October 7th. So there's a huge question mark about what were on those flights. But we don't have a media which is actually doing its job here. So that those questions aren't asked at the official level much at all. The other side of it is that there's a daily spy flight, which started in December, actually, 2023, which goes from RAF Akrotiri and flies over Gaza for 6 hours. And that's explicitly collecting intelligence for Israel. Now, the UK military say, well, that's for hostage rescue. But that, again, doesn't add up, because we've only ever had two British citizens hostage in Gaza. One of them was actually killed, most likely by Israel itself. And we're talking about maybe 2,005 hours of footage over Gaza in the past year. So that doesn't explain it at all. My hunch is that they say it's for hostage rescue because that's semantic wordplay. If you look at how Israel present their genocide in Gaza is all done in terms of hostage rescue. That's the whole top line. So if you're the British government and you're saying, well, our intelligence is only to do with hostage rescue, well, that kind of includes the whole. If you really were going to be pushed, you could say, well, we said that because Israel present their whole operation as a hostage rescue operation. So my hunch is we're giving intelligence to them for up to and including military targeting itself. And in fact, there was a Liberal Democrat lord in the House of Lords here who asked a parliamentary question. This is a system where parliamentarians can ask government departments questions. He said, can you confirm that intelligence we're handing to Israel from these flights is not being used for military targeting? And the Ministry of Defense did not answer that question. So that's highly suspicious. Another element of that is that the special forces, which I mentioned a bit earlier, now special forces are a highly secretive element of the UK military and highly secretive element of most militaries. Most militaries, you can get zero information about the special forces on purpose because it's basically a unaccountable enforcement mechanism of the establishment. And they can fight covert wars all over the world, and no one ever knows about it. Britain's fought 7 in the last 10 years, for example, in places like Yemen, Somalia, Syria, and they were. It was exposed in a newspaper here. Actually, it wasn't exposed. It was presented as a good thing, obviously, because it was in the Sun. But the Sun reported on October 27th that the SAS, the Special Forces of the UK, had deployed to RAF Akrotiri for Gaza operations. Again, to say about hostage rescue, but again, as I said, this is probably semantic wordplay. The following day, the UK military sent out a censorship request to all the media that you don't publish any information about the special forces and what they're doing in Gaza or Israel. And that's been acceded to. We've never had any more information. So that is an element that probably reveals direct participation in the ground invasion. Maybe I'm not saying maybe not on the ground in Gaza, but advising the Israeli military on their campaign, and probably being part of the intelligence team that was deployed to Israel. This came out in the New York Times. A UK intelligence team was deployed inside Israel early on in the genocide to provide intelligence to the Israelis, and the Israeli official that leaked this said the UK is providing us with intelligence we cannot collect on our own. So and this is only what we know, bear in mind, and this has come out through some leaks in the mainstream in the US media, by the way, nothing in the UK, and through some initial articles which were kind of celebratory, but obviously it was a bit of a mistake on their part. But we're scratching the surface here, and this is why I say we're not complicit, we're participants. And it goes for the United States too. When I mentioned that intelligence team that the UK deployed, that article was talking about the UK and US intelligence team. So a US intelligence team was also deployed inside Israel to help them with their Gaza offensive. Plus you have US Special Forces flights, which I found, going from RAF Akrotiri to Israel as well, and we don't know what they're doing, what they're carrying. Probably Special Forces soldiers. They're unmarked planes. They're not even marked as US Air Force. They're just unmarked. The way I found out that they were US Special Forces was I got the serial number and compared it to some other planes that had been used by the Special Forces and found that it was the same plane. So it's a tripartite genocide. It's Israel getting it done, the US providing most of the arms and special forces and intelligence, and the UK providing intelligence, special forces, and logistics. So it's a horror. It's a horror, and the only reason that there's not pressure brought on the government here, particularly in the UK, to stop it is because the mainstream media basically have completely blacked out the whole UK role. And you mentioned the arms licenses, which were recently suspended by the Labour government. That was 30 arms licenses out of 350 years, so like 8%. The only reason that happened was because the only part of the UK role that is ever talked about in the mainstream is the arms. So there was pressure from the civil society, from activists, from parliamentarians to stop the arms sales. So, and that had an impact because the Labour government felt they had to suspend some. If the media was doing its job and telling the story of the intelligence, the logistics, the Cyprus angle, then the government would be under a lot of pressure to stop that too. And that's actually a more important part of it. So the media, that's why I believe the media is complicit in this as well, because they're not informing the public of what is going on. And the public, therefore, is not able to pressure their government to stop what our tax money is paying for, which is participation in a genocide. I think that in the absence of the mainstream media, though, the legal institutions should pick up the baton and actually investigate the British ministers and US officials for their role and prosecute them, I believe. I think there's even the information we've turned up at Declassified UK, which I'm no longer at, but for a year we were, and they're still doing it, we were revealing the UK role. There's enough there to charge ministers, I believe. And that's just a couple of reporters working on this. Imagine if you had the resources of a huge international legal institution with the powers of discovery and other mechanisms which we don't have access to. You could easily build a case that these ministers should be prosecuted. I don't think it will happen, but it should happen.
And on top of that, I think the media establishment themselves eventually can be legally, bound by all these legal proceedings. The ICJ ruling, they're actually complicit in the genocide by not doing their work, or by, conveying the wrong information or obfuscating certain information and so on and so forth.
Well, there's like in Nazi Germany, well, before Nazi Germany, but Julius Strecker, who was the founder of Der Stürmer newspaper, which was a virulently anti-Semitic newspaper in Germany that became the kind of propaganda organ of the Nazis when they were in power. He was tried at the Nuremberg trials and hung merely because he was a founder of the paper and putting out propaganda. So there is a precedent for prosecuting people who do propaganda for genocidal entities and genocidal regimes. So I think, and also I think there's other legal mechanisms whereby if you voice support for genocide, which obviously you see every day, and our government as well do it, you can be prosecuted. I was talking to a lawyer recently who said that there are mechanisms. It's not been done very much, but again, we're in new territory here. We're in totally new territory, and the Israelis have messed up the whole system, even for the US and the UK, because even before in Iraq, they were talking nice things about what they wanted to take to the Iraqis, although it was a huge crime that killed 1 million people and destroyed the country. Bush and Blair were saying we want to take freedom and democracy and all these wonderful things to the Iraqis. Whereas the Israelis are a kind of mad dog ally in the Middle East, just says, well, we're dealing with human animals and we're going to withdraw water, food, and electricity, which is what Gallant said early on in the genocide, from 1 million kids. So they're laying it all out in the open. The mask is off. Which is not good for the US and UK in terms of their soft power operations, because the ideologies which support this whole system are kind of being blown up in Gaza as well. But I think that if we carry on the momentum, yeah, we can start imagining actually bringing to justice our own criminals and our own propagandists for genocide, which would be amazing.
Absolutely.
And importantly, sorry, just add one thing, and importantly, would change the world, because there would be a deterrent in place for the next people to not do it. This is why it's so important that we bring justice to the criminals that have done the genocide and their supporters, because part of the reason the West gets away and commits so many horrific crimes, including the Gaza genocide, but obviously the war in Iraq, there's plenty of others, is because they know they'll never get prosecuted for it. This is why the whole criminal justice system exists in terms of our society, because they want to put a deterrent in place to stop people committing crimes. That doesn't exist for war criminals in the West. So if we erect that structure, it might mean that it would have an instantly civilizing effect on our foreign policy and on how we operate globally. So it's very, very crucial that we do it.
Absolutely. If the world allows Israel to do this without any punishment or accountability, it's dangerous for the entire world. And hence Mandela's statement, no one's free until Palestinians are free. I mean, it's for everyone in the world. I mean, I can't help, Matt, like it's been 14 months and all the complicity and all the assistance that's coming from the US in terms of military surveillance, security, and all that. And those Hamas fighters are still fighting. I mean, how badly damaged is Hamas, do you think? 14 months on this genocide.
It's difficult to know because we don't get that much information anymore about the resistance operations in Gaza. I mean, I would say, and apparently most of the weapons that are used by Hamas now against the invaders are ones that are repurposed Israeli weapons, because obviously there's no borders to get any weapons in. So it's a ragtag army. It's probably done on a very sort of a loosely organized level now, because they've also killed most of the leadership. Haniyeh was killed in Iran. Sinwar was killed recently. So, but it continues. There's videos being posted of resistance operations against the Israeli occupation forces. But I think that the end will be that the Palestinian Authority will come in and take over. Well, not take over, but be installed as the leader of Gaza after this. And I think the Israelis will take the north of Gaza. The PA will be running the rest of it, and that's what the PA is set up for. What does the PA do in the West Bank? It's a security subcontractor for the occupation. Just this week, they've been killing Palestinians in Jenin camp, who are resistance fighters in Jenin camp, and they're armed and trained by the US and the UK, two countries that are participating in a genocide in Gaza. So they're not there to train them to protect Palestine. They're there to train them to protect Israel effectively from any kind of resistance against the occupation. So I think that they'll move the PA in, and the PA obviously want to do it because it's more power for them. They'll probably get that guy Mohammed Dahlan. I don't know if you know him. He's the one that they wanted to install. The CIA wanted to install in 2006 when they tried to do a coup. I think there's talk that he'll be put in. So it's just they want to basically just keep. They won't let any kind of resistance come up again, and they'll install a PA regime to stop that and keep the Palestinians on life support for as long as they can. They tried to kick them all out, but I think that's failed. I think their initial plan was probably just to ethnically cleanse the whole of Gaza.
Yeah.
Now, that was my feeling, that Netanyahu saw this as his 9/11 moment, and he could actually completely solve what they call the Palestinian question. Palestinian question is,
this is what I wanted to say. I mean, this is what I had in mind. I mean, do you think they're going to exploit the moment and just continue on that plan of Greater Israel? I mean, my fear now is, a temporary truce with Hamas in Gaza, and then Israel can take advantage of that the way they took advantage of the truce with Hezbollah and went into Syria and took all these swaths of land in Syria. So what I fear is, if there is a truce with Hamas, Hamas is bound by it. They can go and do whatever they want in the West Bank with the assistance and supervision of the PA, and eventually they can come back to Gaza. So it's just, I mean, given what's happening in Syria, all the attention is in Syria now. I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's two sides to it. There's what they want to do and what they can do, because I think that I think their initial plan was maybe to ethnically cleanse the whole of Gaza, but they couldn't because Egypt refused to take all the refugees effectively. Now they seem to be depopulating and ethnically cleansing and exterminating people who stay in northern Gaza. So I think they want northern Gaza gone. I think their aim was to do South Lebanon as well, but they got their asses kicked in South Lebanon and had to withdraw. Syria is obviously just doesn't exist as a state really at the moment, so they're taking advantage of that. I think that in the West Bank, My hunch is that they will take, like after Oslo, they divided it into area A, B, and C, C being the Israeli controlled area, I think, which is 60% of the West Bank. So I think that their final solution for that will be just annex the whole of area C, and make the rest of them, which would be like 12 or 13 little autonomous Palestinian regions in the middle of area C, just have them living as subjugated sort of Untermenschen for eternity. I don't know if that, to me, that doesn't sound sustainable for 100, 200 years. But the only other option is they literally just massacre them all and move them out of, or move them into Jordan. But I don't think they're going to be able to do that. So I think, and if you look at the plan that Netanyahu was touting in the 1990s, it was called Alon Plus. And it was what I'm saying. It was just annexing all of Area C, 60% of the West Bank, and leaving the rest as non-contiguous little cantons that which were connected by roads, which were crisscrossed by Israeli highways. So I think they'll probably do that. But I think they're just going down the list. If you look at what they're doing, so they basically have destroyed Gaza. It's not habitable anymore. It's if you look at pictures of Rafah or Deir Bala
Jabalia
or
or
Jabalia, they're gone. Like Jabalia's gone, Rafah's most of it's gone. Like you can't rebuild that. They're not doing that because they want it to be rebuilt by anyone. They want it. They want to make it completely uninhabitable. And as Moshe Dayan said, who was once Israeli defense minister, he said he was asked about the plan for the Palestinians. He said they can live like dogs, and whoever wants to leave can leave. And that's basically what their philosophy is. They destroyed Gaza. If you want to stay in some destroyed place that we're not going to allow to be habitable, then fine, but just leave otherwise. And they're hoping that they'll leave. So yeah, so there's that. I think that they'll annex the northern part of Gaza. They'll probably take it. I don't know about the West Bank when they'll move to do their final solution in the West Bank, but I think that will be to take all of Area C, and maybe B. I don't know. And then Syria, I think they're going to permanently occupy that part of Syria, and that is a land grab, obviously, because they've seen their opportunity, because there's no resistance at all. And in fact, the new government in Syria has not even said that they'll ever resist it in any way. In Lebanon, it seems that they have been kind of defeated again, but Nasrallah's dead, and they've decapitated Hezbollah effectively, and also its supply lines now from Iran have been locked off by the fall of the Assad regime. So they've done that. Assad's gone, which was a long-term goal of Israel. So they're just going down the list. My sense is next it'll be Iran. And what it is I'm an atheist, so I'm not into religion, but it seems to me that there's basically a Sunni Shia sectarian battle going on, and and actually there's an interview of Alistair Crook, who was a former MI6 officer and security advisor to the EU delegation to the Middle East from 1997 to 2003. He gave an interview recently where he said that basically after the war in Lebanon in 2006, US Vice President Cheney met with Prince Bandar, who was the Saudi head of intelligence. Cheney was moaning about Iraq. The invasion of Iraq was meant to weaken Iran, but look, you just got Hezbollah beating Israel in this war. And Prince Bandar was saying, well, said that the king of Saudi Arabia said we need to take out Syria. That's the weak link. And we need to basically ensure a Sunni hegemony in the Middle East, and get rid of what's called the Shia Crescent. And Crook said that that's been US policy basically since 1996, and Israeli policy. Basically, you use the Gulf states to get rid of the Ba'athist regimes like Saddam and Assad, and then move on to Iran. And then you have basically Zionist, like the Gulf states are basically Zionist states. And then you've got rid of Assad, you got rid of Saddam Hussein, you got rid of they're going to go to Iran next, and basically all resistance is being dismantled. It won't work, I don't think, in the long term, because none of these plans ever do. When you have a system of oppression, you always have resistance. That's just the nature of human beings. So they're just going to be playing whack-a-mole for the next however long Israel lasts, which might not be that long. But at the moment, in terms of the short-term goals, they have achieved certain goals, although I think have irrevocably damaged their reputation and standing globally, which is important. It's not. I talk to Palestinian friends who say, well, what does that actually mean if they can continue doing the genocide and they can do whatever they want? But in the short term, that is true. But I think in the long term, when you have a whole generation radicalized by the genocide in Gaza, that will come to fruition at some point. Those people, our generation, or the younger generation to me, will someday enter the foreign ministries and the presidential palaces, and there is an awareness of what Israel is that I think is not going to go away. So although in the short term they've achieved their goals, I think that they've destroyed their brand and in doing it. So there is hope in that sense.
100%. I mean, whatever plan Netanyahu has, long-term, short-term plan, do you think it aligns well with whatever Trump has in mind for the region?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I think that US foreign policy is run in the interest of Israel rather than in the interest of the United States in the Middle East. It's this big debate about is the US support for Israel and its policies and its outlook in Washington a result of the lobby, or is it a result of the fact that US imperial interests align with Israel? My feeling is that it's mainly because the lobby and is so powerful that it's very, very difficult for US planners who are working on the Middle East to make policies which aren't in the interests of Israel. And in fact, there was a CIA report I found from the 80s actually the other day, a secret one, where it said if we continue supporting Israel blindly like this, we're going to put ourselves at risk and damage our interests in the Middle East. And it called for a more even-handed, that was the quote, policy in the Middle East, i.e., not just so pro-Israel. That was in the 80s, but it's got much worse since then. And now the US constantly promotes policies which are in Israel's interests. Even Saddam Hussein, Netanyahu went to Congress, didn't he, before the invasion of Iraq and said, you will never regret taking out Saddam Hussein. And now he's saying the same thing about Iran. So in terms of the Trump administration and what I'm talking about, the lobby, the Israelis have near complete control over Trump, it seems like, from his presidential picks. If you look at who he's appointed to his cabinet so far, it's all Israel first people. So I think that, again, to go back to what I was saying about Netanyahu seeing October 7th as his 9/11 moment when he could get what he wanted to do for decades all done in one go and have the excuse to do it, I'm sure he sees Trump and his second presidency as a similar opportunity, because they're never going to get a more pro-Israel president. It's impossible to be more pro-Israel than Trump. He does everything he's told by Israel. If you look at his first presidency, he moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which was completely out of whack with international law and what other countries were doing. And while he was doing it, and while he was there celebrating it, they were massacring the Great March of Return protesters who were peacefully marching to the prison walls of Gaza. So it's monstrous. He's a monster on this and many other things, but again, they're also reckless. It's how much. The question is, how much can they get away with? You can have a policy, but at some stage, these things all get out of your control. Look at what happened in Vietnam, They absolutely destroyed Vietnam for a decade. And then they had to leave in a helicopter from the embassy when it was overrun by the Viet Cong. So the imperial system is fragile by definition. And Trump is not strategic in that sense. And I don't think Netanyahu is strategic in that sense. They're just maximalists. They take everything they can and do everything they can. And there might be some unintended consequences. Like even if you look at the invasion of Iraq, the US really, like, they took out Saddam, who was an enemy, but but then they installed a Shia government who was part of also sort of in a more complex way, but part of the axis of resistance. Parts of it are um, and supporters of Hezbollah, the Shia. And that was an unintended consequence. But who knows what they're going to do? I mean, also just to add on to what Trump did in his last presidency, he also assassinated Soleimani, the Iranian general, in Iraq in a car, like just bananas, outlaw behavior, gangster behavior. You can't do that. And I think that we'll see more of that. And funnily enough, some parts of it's such the perception of it is all distorted. You know, you even get people on the left saying, well, he's against the deep state and he's against the war machine. Just look at his policies. He does everything he's told, essentially. And I feel like in terms of the people around him, he's literally gonna do whatever Netanyahu tells him to do. So it's a scary situation for the Palestinians. Although I would also add, and I'll finish with this, that I said this to my Palestinian friend the other day. I was like, essentially, what worse can he be? How can he be worse than Biden? How can you? There's nothing that the Israelis could do short of putting Palestinians lining them up and putting them into gas chambers. They are literally massacring 100 people every day, blowing up kids, blowing up kids' limbs. Like that, the level of atrocity in Gaza, it's kind of impossible to imagine anything worse, short of like industrialized slaughter. Um, so and that's all under Biden. So I don't really understand what Trump could be worse for the Palestinians. I would say though that he can be worse than Iran. And maybe we could talk about that because the latest the overthrow of Assad, who was a brutal dictator, but was a key part of what was called the axis of resistance, because has gone now.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do want to talk about this, and it's sort of a contentious issue to talk about. I mean, what is happening in Syria? I mean, we understand that Syrians at this moment, at this juncture in time, I mean, they have all the right to celebrate, in terms of, getting rid of this dictator, this monster of a dictator. And I also should have the right to feel content about the situation as a person, as a Palestinian as well, but with a bit of concern and cautious optimism as well, and also anger of what Israel has just done. So when I hear all these commentators interviews, I watched an interview with Scott Ritter today with Jeffrey Sachs. Are they jumping the gun on what's happening in Syria, or is it actually part of a plan? But I mean, it sounds like whoever is playing this situation is actually, abusing the sense of sympathy that the world has for the Syrian people now. So, I mean, Syrian people, when they see these kind of commentators, they stop watching them, they stop following them because, they've been called Assadists of some sort. But I mean, how do we talk about Syria?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I think it's just complicated, and it's basically there's people are attacked if they take either position or have a nuanced position, and I think that it's undoubted that Assad was a brutal dictator, hereditary dictator. He took over from his dad Hafez, who massacred 20 to 30,000 people in Hama in 1982 who rose up against him. It was a brutal police state. But it also was part of the axis of resistance. And Hezbollah is the main, or was the main problem for Israel, in terms of contiguous with Israel, the balance of forces, and its supply line through Syria is now gone. So it's okay to understand that the Syrians have every right to be happy. And I was happy seeing all the hellholes that Assad had emptied. but you can also have a geopolitical analysis of why that came about and in whose interest it was. And it's clear that from decades back, the empire wanted to get rid of Assad, and not because he was a brutal dictator who oppressed his people. Saudi Arabia is a brutal dictatorship which oppresses its people, and is not only backed diplomatically, but is supported through intelligence and military to keep the Wahhabi dictatorship in power in Saudi Arabia, and has been since the 1930s when the British installed it. So that's not why they wanted to get rid of him. They wanted to get rid of him because he wasn't on their side, much like Saddam Hussein. The discourse is similar to 2003. So in 2003, although it was less of it from the left, but people, centrists and the right would say, well, if you would say you were anti the US invasion, they'd say, oh, you love Saddam Hussein. And you say, no, that's not the case. They were just saying, I don't think that the way to get rid of him or is to invade the country in an illegal invasion, number one. Number two, the US and the UK aren't going in because they want to install democracy. They're going in because they want the oil and they want to have a leader who's pliant. And in the case of Syria, there was a massive covert operation by the CIA, which began in 2012, called Operation Timber Sycamore, which was budgeted at $1 billion a year. So it was one of the biggest covert operations in American history. And it was similar to what they did in Afghanistan in the 1980s. They just plied groups with weapons and training who were trying to overthrow Assad, most including radical Islamist groups like Al Qaeda and which was called Al Nusra, and that's where the revolution and the uprising was real in 2011. I was actually there a couple of years before and knew people who were involved in the uprising, and one of my friends was detained in Sednaya and tortured, and I helped get him out of the country. So I'm aware of the brutality, but what it became was an international war after that. Assad brutally repressed the protests. He could have at that stage initiated a process to bring about democratic reforms and change the country. He should have done that, but he didn't. He brutally repressed it, but as it went on, it became a major international war when the CIA got involved, MI6, the Gulf states, arming what they called moderate rebels, but were often radical Islamists. And then that brings us up to what happened recently, and HTS, which is the group that kind of led the move on Damascus, is a kind of its lineage goes back to Al Qaeda in Iraq, and actually even ISIS. Mohammed Abu Jalani, who's now, like, I guess, the de facto leader of Syria, he was a member. He was in Iraq in 2003 to 2006, working with Al Qaeda in Iraq, which was headed by Zarqawi. And Zarqawi's whole philosophy was to start a sectarian war between the Sunni and the Shia in Iraq, which he did. And Jalani was part of that. They blew up Shia shrines. There was 2 bombings of the 3rd holiest site in Shia Islam in 2006 and 2007, which kind of sparked the Iraqi civil war. Horrendous crimes, devastating. Jalani then moved to Syria and was given $1 billion by Baghdadi, who was later the head of ISIS, to start Al Qaeda in Syria, which he did, and he called it Al Nusra. And then Baghdadi wanted him to be Al Nusra to be subsumed into ISIS. Jalani refused, then created HTS and said, we're not part of Al Qaeda anymore. But essentially, that is the lineage, and they were running Idlib for years since the truce agreement between Russia and Turkey. So and then they launched this offensive. So these aren't people that their whole philosophy for the Middle East was not about fighting Zionism. Effectively, it was about fighting sectarian war between Sunni and Shia. That's horrific, and they committed horrific crimes. Jalani's now celebrated in the Western media, but what he did in Iraq and also what he did in Syria, there's awful record. So I'm not hopeful for for what Syria will become. And also the other thing is obviously on top of that, you have the outside powers. Effectively, it was a Turkish invasion of Syria which overthrew Assad. You know, HTS and Syrian National Army, which are the two main forces which led the offensive. HTS was more concerned with overthrowing Assad, and the SNA was more concerned with destroying the autonomous Kurdish region, which is called Rojava, and they're continuing to do that, by the way. But yeah, I don't see any good is going to come out of that because SNA and Erdogan want to destroy Kurdish autonomous region because they're scared that it's going to empower the Kurdish population in Turkey. The Israelis have already occupied more land than they did in the 1967 war. Then you have the US wanting to control the oil fields. So it's just going to be a carve up of the country, and it's effectively going to be run on a Palestinian Authority model, which I said before. So the sort of dismembered state will be run impossible for it to run without imperial support from aid, and there's already £50 million in aid has already gone to Syria to the new government. That's how they're going to set it up. They're going to leave it on life support. They can't make any sovereign decisions. Israel will do whatever it wants. It's already destroyed within 48 hours. It dropped 500 bombs on Syria and destroyed the whole of the Navy and the whole of the Air Force. So it's a demilitarized, much like the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority there, a demilitarized state which relies on the imperial powers to operate. So, and this is why it's such a tragedy, because as you said, Syrians have every right to celebrate now to be free of this brutal dictator, but nothing good ever happens in the shadow of the empire and in the shadow of external powers who are not in Syria to ensure it's democratic and sovereign. They're there to ensure the opposite, in fact, that it works in their interests. So you see that it's going to be carved up, much like the Sykes-Picot Agreement, you know, by the French and the British, when the original borders of places like Syria and Lebanon were drawn. You're just seeing a rehash of that, unfortunately. But again, as I mentioned with Netanyahu's plan for the Middle East, like all these things, there are unintended consequences and unintended and unknown unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld said, that things might not play out as the imperial powers want. We'll just have to wait and see.
To the point of Sykes-Picot, Matt, do you think the CIA or the Mossad had anything to do with the recent events that led to the taking and the falling of Assad regime? I mean, directly or indirectly, because we saw the destruction of all military sites by Israel straight away, and also the timing of what happened, like an hours right after that truce with Hezbollah. So
yeah, I think they did, and my hunch is that the Russians came to an agreement with Turkey, maybe Israel as well, and the United States, because they did not support Assad to that point, and the Syrian army stood down completely. So I wonder if there was some agreement where Putin was just like, Assad's done, we're not going to support him, and he got something from Turkey or from the United States, because apparently Russia can now retain all its military bases in Syria. I don't know if that's true, but it sounds like that was an agreement where he said, look, you can take down Assad, but give us our military bases. I do think probably the main mover was Turkey, but Turkey's a leading member of NATO. It doesn't really operate without US knowledge. So I imagine the US know. I imagine the Israelis knew as well. Yeah, as you said, it happened on the day, literally on the day that the ceasefire with Hezbollah was signed. And also Netanyahu took credit. He said, our attacks on Hezbollah created the ground for what happened. And so I think it was probably a Turkish, Israeli, US operation. Whether and also that's speculation, obviously, because we don't know. But if you look at the history of the rebels who were fighting Assad, Israel was supporting them. It came out, the defense minister admitted it. They were treating Al-Qaeda fighters in Israeli hospitals in Golan Heights. And it goes back decades. They've been trying to get rid of the Assad regime for decades, the Israelis, the US, and Turkey. So yeah, I think that more will come out. It's quite interesting now, actually, that you're seeing quite a lot of propaganda being put out that Assad was pro-Israel, you know. I think that's very telling that they want to push this, that they want to push this idea that and it's kind of integral to the overthrow of Assad, right? Which is people who people want to see it as like not bad for the Palestinians because it's
Or promoting the HTS as well.
exactly, yeah. And yeah, I mean it's crazy. I mean it goes to the power of the propaganda system, what they're saying about HTS, like how this guy who was in ISIS and Al Qaeda, which killed 3,000 people in the United States in 2001 in the worst piece of terrorism in US history. Uh, and now 23 years later, the Washington Post and New York Times are selling him as some kind of like
Moderate.
moderate. It's crazy. It's crazy. If you told someone on September 12th, 2001, in the United States, in 23 years' time, all the mainstream papers will be promoting Al Qaeda, they wouldn't believe you. But that's the power. That's the whole point about these people is it doesn't matter. We don't care who these people are, what they do. It's are you useful to us? And if you're useful to us, we'll use you. And if you're useful to us and we use you, our media will get behind you because the media follow the state line. That's the effective thing. If Jelani stopped doing as he was told, and he's already said we won't allow Syria to be used to attack Israel. We've got no problem with any countries. Our only problem is with Iran. That's what he said. So he's saying all the right things that fit with their empire. If he stopped doing that, it'd be out the door in like a couple of hours, and the media would be saying that he's a brutal butcher who blew up Shia mosques in Iraq and all the rest of it. But the propaganda system is a beautiful thing in the West. Barely anyone even notices. There's one newspaper, particularly here in the UK, called the Daily Telegraph, which is extremely right wing. It's kind of like the house journal of the Tory party, and it's read by little grandmas in like the countryside. And I've been laughing recently because they've done loads of articles about Jelani being this kind of like diversity friendly guy. There was one where it was like the moderate rebel who wants to take Syria, but without upsetting children or something like that. And is like, and I'm just imagining all these little grannies in the countryside in Britain, like really starting to love this Al Qaeda guy just because the Daily Telegraph is promoting him as this like teddy bear. It's quite funny, but it works, you know, it works. And unfortunately, we've seen what happens. This is why you mentioned about optimism. Like, look at we've got some precedent for this stuff. Look at Libya. Again, Gaddafi was not a good guy, but he was taken out in 2011 in a NATO attack, and the country's a failed state. All the weapons, oh sorry, all the oil contracts got awarded to Western companies, so it's working for us, or it's working for a small elite in our countries. But the country's a mess because nothing good happens in the shadow of a country which is being dominated by external powers. It just doesn't. There's no way. If you're not a sovereign country, no one's there to help you. They're there to exploit you and take your resources. Obviously, that's not just the US or Turkey. That's also Russia. Well, everyone has their interests in why they want to be in a country. But unfortunately, unless you have some kind of way to resist that, it's very, very hard not to just become kind of some kind of failed state like Libya or Iraq for a long time.
I mean, with Jelani saying that he's not going to allow Syria to be a launching pad against Israel, I can't help but thinking what's going to happen to the axis of resistance. I mean, now that that connection has been severed, I mean, I don't know. I don't even know how Hamas is surviving now, fighting the invasion of Israel into Gaza. I could assume that Hezbollah can hold its ground for a while, but without that supply chain through Syria, I don't know what's I'm not feeling optimistic about this.
No, me neither. I think the axis of resistance has been broken. Because the other point is that obviously Lebanon is effectively a US controlled country, that has this kind of parastatal organization called Hezbollah. But when you have cut that link with Iran, and then you have the Israelis in the south, and you have the central government, which effectively is going to do what is told by the United States. It's going to be Hezbollah is going to be extremely isolated. And then bear in mind also that they're gonna do Iran as well. That is for sure. In my mind, that is for sure. Probably under Trump. So the axis of resistance has been smashed. And it's a long-term project. This goes back decades. Like after 9/11, what's his name? General Wesley Clark, who was a senior general in the US military, said he was inside during in a period after 9/11, and he said he went to a meeting and he was told we're going to do 7 countries in 5 years. Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Somalia, Sudan, a couple of others. And if you look at the list of who they were saying, they've basically done them all apart from Iran now. And they don't tolerate resistance. That is, Netanyahu's a fascist, and they have a fascist mentality that all resistance must just be smashed. And anyone who raises a finger of resistance needs to be killed effectively. And they've killed, and they do it through genocide now, but also like targeted assassination of anyone. You know, like Sinwar's gone, Haniyeh, Nasrallah. They're probably trying to assassinate Khomeini. Yeah. So the point is, like, unless something happens with Israel, it's just going to go on and on and on and on because no, they need to be stopped, and they only understand force. That's why they're dismantling the axis of resistance. They know that they don't have to change at all unless they meet resistance. Like, look at Lebanon. They would have loved to take the whole of South Lebanon, but they couldn't because they met resistance. Fascists like them only understand resistance. So yeah, it's not optimistic. And also, if you look at how the Zionists have captured the Gulf states, and to a degree Turkey, you know, because Erdogan talks to talk, but essentially still sending oil, actually allows planes to be to fly to Incirlik base at Adana and then on to Arif Akritiri, which we were talking about earlier. So US Air Force planes. So I imagine some of those are carrying weapons for Israel, you know. He talks the talk, but he's effectively not going to do anything to stop Israel. He's much more interested in constructing a new kind of Ottoman Empire. There's no one left on a state level apart from Iran and Yemen, which is kind of it's not actually a functioning state now in that it's split between 2 different states effectively. So yeah, it's only Iran now, and I think that will happen. So yeah, it's an open question. What happens in that context when you have no state backing, but a very millions and millions of people who want to fight Israel effectively? I don't know what happens in that context, and part of it may mean that that sentiment is turned on the regimes themselves, which I guess is happening in the Gulf some more because the genocide has really exposed how close to the Israelis the Gulf states are. So it might be that that kind of becomes a problem for them and their ability to stay in power. I hope it does, because it would be great if the people of the Gulf could overthrow their dictators like the Syrians did. Whether that happens, because the point is the empire is supporting those dictators rather than wants to get them overthrown. So it's quite hard in that situation.
To my understanding, it's inevitable. It has to happen. I mean, the Arab people, they have to be liberated from all these occupiers, really, because they're extension to these colonizer and imperialists. Otherwise, they can continue living under the boots of all these aforementioned categories.
Yeah.
I mean, it looks very grim and dark ahead, Matt. So are you optimistic? Are we well equipped with what we need to kind of bring down the state of Israel and make it the pariah state that it should be?
You know what? I don't like to say I'm optimistic because of what we're seeing in Gaza, because I feel different after this year. I'm sure you do, and I'm sure a lot of people do. You know, like when you've consumed that much horror and know your government supporting it, and there's something particularly upsetting about Gaza in that it's a prison as well, and not only a prison where 70% of people are refugees or descendants of refugees. It's like it's horror on horror on horror of the situation. Half of them kids. So watching that, I can't. No one can feel optimistic about the human condition because I feel like we've seen a side of humanity which is the darkest side I've ever seen. Having said that, I've also seen the best of humanity in the Gazans who are persevering in the face of all this. You see the best of humanity and the worst of humanity. But so I don't like to say I'm optimistic, but I'm hopeful that things have changed on Israel, and I'm hopeful that things have changed on Zionism because I think that's the key. And it's been protected for too long. It's not just about saying the genocide should end. It's not just about saying there should be a two-state solution, which Israel's never going to allow anyway. It's about saying we need to dismantle this fascistic settler colony, which is predicated on expulsion and subjugation of the native people. And it can't be tolerated by anyone who has any kind of belief in values like freedom, human rights, equality. And the Zionist lobby has always tried to present Zionism in this kind of progressive terms, you know, like a homeland for for oppressed people and all this kind of other stuff. A people without a land for a land without people. Uh, it's all the opposite of the truth. It's a fascistic ideology, effectively, and also how it developed. You know, like the main kind of intellectual godfather of Likud and all those people is Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was a fascist. He was an admirer of Mussolini, and he came up with this idea of the Iron Wall, where they said the Arabs will never allow the Jews to live in their land. So what we need to do is erect an iron wall, which meant just basically kill them so much that they are subjugated and accept you just by force. They have to, and that's a fascistic idea, you know, you just have to pummel someone into the ground. And that is Zionism. I don't buy this whole thing of like there was this liberal Zionism. Like liberal Zionism is a contradiction in terms. It doesn't exist. You can't steal a people's land and push them into two little prisons and do it in a liberal way. There's nothing liberal about it. It's quite funny that it's similar to the United States. If you look at the British when they went there, and the early presidents like Thomas Jefferson and people like that, they're held up as these nice liberal types. But what was done to the Native Americans, there was nothing liberal about that. Indian removal under Andrew Jackson, they literally massacred thousands of people and moved thousands of people, you know, the Trail of Tears and all that. It's all ideology to kind of whitewash the reality. So to answer your question, I think all that is exploded now. I really do. I'm not just saying that to sign a optimistic note. I think that it has, and I don't think it's going back. And I think we also can talk about the Israel lobby, which is very, very important because we want to win, right? We want to dismantle Zionism. We want Palestinians and Jewish people to live in peace and equality in Palestine. But one of the major reasons we can't do that, and one of the major obstacles is the power that the Israeli state has over our own governments. And for so long, you cannot. And and still in the mainstream, it's quite hard to talk about the Israel lobby. You're called a conspiracy theorist, but that's how they get away with guiding so much policy in the West. And so we need to, I think that has been breached in a way that it wasn't before. So again, it's promising. But and the world is awake. I have to say, just like it's never been. I've never seen it. You have so much interest in Gaza by people who were not political before, and I get told by people, I get people come up to me after events and stuff and say, I was never political before the last year, but seeing my government support what I'm watching has completely changed my view of the whole world. And that is powerful, and I think it's happened on a general level. So if we do the right things, i.e. maintain the momentum and push forward, then I think that could be a really powerful moment. I think human consciousness has kind of changed, and that doesn't happen easily. And the cost has been way too high with Gaza, but I feel it's real. So of course that's a hopeful progression, and we need to capitalize.
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, things are getting worse. But if we do nothing, things are going to get even worse. So at least we need to continue doing what we're doing, pressuring our governments, the state of this Zionist regime to kind of comply with its obligations. So we got to keep fighting and not cave down to the devastation, no matter how hard the road ahead is.
Yeah.
I can't really thank you enough, Matt, for this great conversation. Hopefully at some point in the future we can have another conversation. I mean, it's a highly dynamic situation. Probably in a couple of hours something will happen and then flips the whole equation. So
yeah.
yeah, really thank you, and I appreciate
Thank
that.
you.
Great.
Good to join you. Yeah, I'll be back whenever you want me.
Perfect.
Take
Thanks
care.
a lot, Matt. All right. Enjoy your day.
Thank you. You too.